Thank you for joining us today for the CLE. For those of you who know my habit of asking people to move forward, please do if you want to, but since we are running late, I'm not going to force you to do that. My name is Oren Gross. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at the Law School, and on behalf of the Board of Advisors Academic Engagement Committee, I want to thank you all for attending today's CLE. We're glad that you are here and hope that this is a valuable resource for you both in building your Minnesota law network and for your professional development. Today's presentation, by the way, is recorded, and the link to the recording will be shared afterwards. We will make sure to leave time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please save your questions until the end. Now for the most dreaded words whenever you do an event like this, and those are, the next speaker requires no introduction. So for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to introduce the speaker. Professor Ni Aolain has truly done it all. She is a University of Minnesota Regents Professor, the highest academic rank that we have here at the university. She holds a Rubina Chair in Law, Public Policy and Society. She's the Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center at the Law School. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute and the International Commission of Jurists, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Irish Academy. Earlier this year, she was appointed an honorary King's Counsel by King Charles III. Concurrently with her work here at the University of Minnesota, Professor Ni Aolain is also a professor of law at Queen's University of Belfast School of Law. She's the author of numerous award-winning books and articles that are too many to count, with particular focus on emergency powers, counterterrorism, human rights, conflict regulation, transitional justice, and sex-based violence in times of war. Professor Ni Aolain won some of the most prestigious national and international awards, including the Leverhulme Fellowship, British Academy Awards, Fulbright Scholarship, the Allon Prize, the Robert Schuman Scholarship, a European Commission Award, and the Lawlor Fellowship. She was nominated twice by the Irish government to the European Court of Human Rights, the first woman and the first academic lawyer to be thus appointed. She served as a member of the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law, a board chair of the Open Society Foundation's Women Program, and the board of the Center for Victims of Torture National Advisory Council. If that's not enough, and most relevant to the present presentation, in 2017, she was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Her second term ended in November 2023. In this capacity, as Special Rapporteur, Professor Ni Aolain worked closely with states and United Nations entities to advance human rights protections in some of the most difficult contexts globally. And today she will share with us extracts from her forthcoming book, drawing on her work as Special Rapporteur with a particular focus on the conflict in Syria and the counter-terrorism practices of state and non-state actors in North East Syria and their human rights consequences. Professor Ni Aolain, thank you very much for taking the time. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I am particularly glad, given how late in the semester we are and how exhausted everybody is, to have you all here, and great to see so many of my students. So I'm going to talk about my book. The title is The Road to Qamishli, Chasing Law in a Time of Counterterrorism, which is actually co-authored with the woman who was a colleague and friend, Dr. Anne Sherburg, who was my senior legal advisor for 6 years as I held this UN mandate. And in a way, one of the things I want to sort of do with this book, I'm writing a book that I'd like to see on an airport shelf. We'll see how far that goes. But the goal here is to write a book that's more generally accessible to a non-law, non-IR, non-political science audience. It's not intended to be an academic book. And it's really intended, as the motif of the title says, to tell a story about a journey. And that journey started when I was appointed to my UN mandate in 2017. And as the Associate Dean, who's also my husband, can tell you, this was not a job I was anticipating getting. In fact, when I applied for the role with the support of the Irish government, I was distinctly told I wouldn't get the job. And the reason I was told I wouldn't get the job is that the previous office holder, there's generally geographical rotation on UN positions, previous office holder was British, and so the general assumption was that it was going to rotate, but it was like going to be a good first run. It's like trying to get your your toe in the water for a position. And we were about to board a flight with our 3 small children in the middle of the summer when my phone started hopping in Belfast, and I was like, something happened. And the something was that I had been appointed to the role of UN Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism. And pretty early on, it was clear that this issue of North East Syria and the problem of repatriation was going to be a huge part of the file that I was dealing with. But it's fair to say in 2017, when I first started, there were a lot of things I didn't know about this file. And I was just starting to come to terms with the powers, or if you want, capacities of the UN mandate I held. And let me say a couple of things briefly about that. UN mandate holders are part-time, technically, experts who are appointed with 3 capacities. The first is to issue reports to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. You do that on a yearly basis, and you do that on any issue that you think is an important issue to bring before states. The second capacity you have is to write communications to governments. And when I came into the role, I think the backlog of communications was about 600 cases. So that's a lot of cases, and we'll talk a little more about the capacity of the office to actually do that work. And then the third thing that you can do is undertake country visits with the request, at the request to the government and with the agreement of a territorial state. And when you do a country visit, you are assessing that country's compliance with its human rights obligations, and specifically for me in the area of security and counterterrorism. So the first thing you're doing is coming to terms with actually taking on board that role and the scale of that role. That's the general set of things that any UN Special Rapporteur can do. But in addition, the mandate I held is actually unique in one way. And it's unique because it's the only human rights mandate that is formally situated in the New York counterterrorism architecture. So in their wisdom in 2005, states decided that the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights would also sit in the New York security space as what's called an entity. And that entity, as an entity in the New York security space, I was the only entity responsible for the intersection of counterterrorism and human rights within the UN system. All of that was happening with a 0 budget. There is no budget for this. And the role is technically a part-time role. I continue to be a full-time law professor here at the University of Minnesota and in Belfast. So as you can see, trying to do anything much, but particularly trying to come to grips with a really complex set of cases was going to be really hard. And the most, as I said, the most complicated early set of cases I was dealing with was the situation in the Middle East, and of which Syria was one of those situations. Syria, as you know, was 2017, Syria is still in the midst of a complex civil war. The government of Syria, the Syrian Arab Republic, does not control all of its territory. There are at least 4 other states who have a territorial presence on Syrian soil. That is the United States, which has several bases at the time, the Russian Federation, Turkey, which has taken a sizable piece of Syrian territory without the consent of the Syrian government, and Iran. So you have at least 4 other states in the picture on the territory, and you also have multiple non-state armed groups. The most notable of which for this purpose is an entity called the Syrian Democratic Forces. These are a Western-backed group which controls sizable territory in northeast Syria and are considered by the Turkish government as terrorists, but supported by the United States. So that's one group. And then on top of that, we have another set of and layered groups, which are the various designated terrorist groups which had held territory in Syria and Iraq from about 2011, 2012 onwards. There's a lot to say about the Syrian conflict. I'm not really going to give an in-depth introduction to the Syrian conflict, but I'm happy to answer questions on it. But the 2 things I want to sort of stress at this point, one is the complexity of the just territorial picture in Syria. The fact that the territory wasn't controlled by the territorial state, that there were not just other states, but several non-state armed groups controlling territory in Syria. And from my perspective in 2017 as UN Special Rapporteur, the other really complex piece was that one of those non-state armed groups, the Syrian Democratic Forces, was holding thousands of men, women, and children who were deemed associated with ISIL and other terrorist or designated groups after 2014. And the reason they're holding these people is because in 2014, a global coalition led by the United States and other states, and on the ground it was the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who did most of the work, who essentially dismantled to some degree the Islamic State, the caliphate that had been declared. And we see, as a result of that, the fall of a city called Raqqa, and it's the fall of that city and these other places where the non-state group held territory that leads to thousands upon thousands of women and children, but also men fleeing and coming under the control of the SDF. One of the hardest things when I became Special Rapporteur was actually that we didn't know, we really didn't know very much about what was happening in the territory. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is because there was no access to, start with that, there was just no access to the territory. UN had very limited access, even for humanitarian grounds, there wasn't a great deal of access. The Syrian Arab Republic, the president and his cabinet were essentially for many states being considered as a pariah state. There was simply no engagement with the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, particularly by Western states. So there was not, the usual way you would get information is through the territorial state. That wasn't open. And then you have other states. The United States and its forces in northeast Syria were certainly not saying a lot about what they were doing, and neither were the Russians, the Iranians, or the Turks. So the usual routes you have to have information about what's happening on a territory were largely unavailable. And so one of the challenges then that I was facing as I came into the mandate was to figure out exactly what were the counter-terrorism actions being taken by this kind of cacophony of actors in northeast Syria, but also to better understand what the scale and scope of the violations, if any, were. And so to do that was actually really hard, and it speaks to the challenge of being a UN Special Rapporteur. You have these capacities to visit countries, to issue reports, and to issue communications. The first depends on government being willing to talk to you, and we had a sort of a limited capacity at that time to engage with the Syrians, and the other governments weren't talking very much. And the rest of those things, like communications, depend on information, and there was absolutely almost no information coming out of northeast Syria. And so that then started this sort of process where my team and I were trying to figure out how we would get that information. And we did it a number of ways, and that's where I'm going to start, is we started doing country visits. So early on in the mandate, I was trying to do many things, but as I was trying to figure out what was happening in northeast Syria, we were moving to other countries that had information about the situation. And several of my country visit, my first country visit was to France as UN Special Rapporteur. And during the course of that visit, I did two things. One was I visited several prisons in which individuals who had returned, mostly men, had returned from the battlefield in Syria or had gone to Syria for a period and come back, were being detained, imprisoned, or had been charged and convicted of terrorist offenses. So I had interviewed a sizable number of these men, and so that helped me get a picture of what was happening both in the prisons where they were being held, but also information that they held about family members. The second sort of information was talking to families of those who had left to go to Syria. So of this population that we believed to be held by the Syrian Democratic Forces, sizable numbers of them were Syrian. There was a proportion of them we believed to be Iraqi, but a sizable proportion of them were what we call third country nationals. Individuals, including Americans, I should say, who had traveled from the United States to Syria or Iraq to either participate in hostilities or to do other things. The other things we'll talk about in a minute. But mostly this third country national population was what I was trying to get information on. So by talking to family members in France, in Uzbekistan, in Qatar, in Kazakhstan, we were able to get, because they were still in touch with their family members, we were actually able to start to build a picture of what was happening in North East Syria. And of course, all through this time, we were talking to governments. And when I say we were talking to governments, I would be talking to prime ministers or to ministers in charge who were showing up at the UN for meetings. But we were also talking to intelligence agencies, to militaries. These are the sort of the counterparts for my mandate. These are the people that my mandate would mostly be engaged with on a day-to-day basis. So these early visits, Qatar and France were in my first year or so, and they really helped sort of figure out, first of all, we knew we were starting to get a handle on what the scale of detention was. We were starting to get a handle on what the conditions of confinement were. And we were also starting to get a sense of the engagement of the intelligence services in particular of these states with their nationals in this territory was. In my third year as Special Rapporteur, I was invited to Uzbekistan to do a country visit. And before I went, we had this sense that the Uzbeks they had a large couple of hundred individuals, mostly women and children in the camps. And we had a sense that they were about to do something about that population. And we were 2 days into the visit when we got a call from my team got a call from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to say that over several hundred women and children had been brought back from Syria to Kazakhstan. And my first question was, when can we meet them? And that wasn't a given that the government was going to give me access to meet and interview these women and their children. But we had a good relationship with the government, and they allowed us to visit. So we traveled over a day and a half to get to actually the Caspian Sea, which is, they were being held in a family holiday village, which had been repurposed as a security detainment facility. To meet with these women. And that was actually my first time where I interviewed a sizable number of returnees and got a better understanding of who they were, why they'd gone, what the conditions were, and my ability to meet with and observe the children, but also talk to the intelligence, the security services in Kazakhstan to understand their security assessments, but also what they plan to do to reintegrate and return these women. A couple of years later, similarly, when I went to visit Uzbekistan, they had just brought back 560 women and children from Northeast Syria. And again, it helped build up this picture of what was happening in the camps. Now, I should say, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan were unusual because these were countries who were prepared to take back their nationals. The vast majority of countries were not. And the result of that is a sort of a form of citizen dumping, where you leave your citizens in another territory, where you expect other states to take care of your problem, or you expect a non-state actor to take care of your problem. And so during the course of I suppose, filling out the picture of what was happening in detention in Northeast Syria, I was becoming clearer about what my own legal position was about the obligations of states in this situation. And so over the course of those early years, we also started issuing communications to states about not just their obligation to their nationals, but actually formulating clearly states' legal obligations under international law to repatriate their nationals from this territory. Some of that was done directly through this communication function, but some of it was done in other ways, and that included engaging in multiple judicial and parliamentary proceedings in multiple countries of the national. So there were 57 third country national states involved. That's a lot of countries. Maybe just to say, this is in terms of the proceedings, there are two I would highlight. My team and I were very involved in the legal proceedings involving one British national, a young woman called Shamima Begum. Shamima was 15 years old when she traveled to Syria with two of her teenage friends. There's an infamous picture of the three teenage girls passing through a turnpike at Heathrow Airport. By the time she was 17, Shamima had had two children. Statutory rape by British law, certainly statutory rape in most of the European countries. She gave birth to her third child a couple of weeks after her 18th birthday. All three of her children died of hypothermia or severe health and other complications in a tent in Northeast Syria. And several days after her 18th birthday, after the death of her third child, the British government deprived her of her citizenship and effectively made her stateless. And so we became involved in her legal proceedings, led by an extraordinary British lawyer called Gareth Pearce, that some people in the room will know. And we mostly actually, we lost at almost every stage. The British courts found that Shamima Begum was most likely than not a victim of trafficking and online grooming. And of course, in any other circumstances, those of you who know a little bit about trafficking will know that states are actually understand that there are complex reasons why minors who are trafficked and groomed are subject to and often, in fact, commit violations themselves. But it was the targeting of Shamima Begum as associated with a terrorist group that actually took her out of the category of protection as a victim of trafficking and put her squarely into the group of people who had no protection under international law. So Shamima, in fact, I got to see Shamima in Northeast Syria a year later. I didn't know that when we started her legal proceedings, but she was one of the young women I saw when I was in Northeast Syria. But the goal of this work around the judicial and legal proceedings was actually to force governments under their own domestic law to return. And actually, I think we were pretty successful working with groups of different lawyers in different countries. In France, we took proceedings that resulted actually in the return of sizable numbers of French nationals to France. The same in Canada, proceedings at the Supreme Court, the same in Australia. And we have still cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights. So there's this sort of diplomatic work that's happening, but there's also this sort of practical legal work. So sometime in my third year, as we were trying to collect this information about the situation, as we were starting to pursue different kinds of legal avenues in tandem with domestic lawyers and other international actors, my team and I started talking about how we could kind of fill the gap on what we knew about Syria. And the obvious answer was we needed a visit. We needed to physically get to Syria, because that has always, in my experience, been when you have a country situation and you don't know what's happening on the ground, physically getting there is the absolute best way to understand what's happening. And the reason I'm showing the map, I'll show a couple of maps, is that it tells you, so this tells you a bit about how hard, first of all, Syria at this point, and this is about just before COVID hits when we start talking internally about going to Syria. No one is talking to the Syrians. well, at least no one in the West is talking to the Syrians. We get to know a lot about who's actually talking to the Syrians when we get to Syria. But at the time, even as a human rights expert and as a UN Special Rapporteur, even going to have tea with the ambassador in Geneva was considered high risk, because any legitimization of the Syrian regime was seen as problematic, precisely because the regime, to be clear, has no clean hands. It has murdered, disappeared, used chemical weapons against thousands of its own citizens in the context of the uprising in Syria. This is a brutal and highly problematic regime. And so you're stuck with the kind of obvious ethical question. How do you need to get this information? You want to understand better what's happening. But that requires going through Damascus, and it requires engagement with the regime. So we made that decision. We had some help. There's some things I can say about I can't say about how we were helped to start that dialogue with the Syrian government. But even having that dialogue with the Syrian government, we were faced with this problem. And the problem is the Kurdish forces. Because for me to have access to the territory of Syria, I have to go through Damascus. I had to get the territorial state to agree to allow me in. But actually, the territorial state didn't control the territory I actually needed to get to, and had an agitational relationship with the non-state actor. So it wasn't like I could say to the Syrian foreign minister, you're going to let me in, and I'm going to go talk to the SDF. Because for them, recognition of the non-state actor, whom they also view as illegally occupying part of their territory, was problematic. And that sort of speaks to the constructive ambiguity of these kinds of negotiations. And it took, I would say, several years to build up trust with the Syrians. But we were still faced with the problem that we needed to have access to a territory that the government didn't have access to. And that required taking another risk, which was how were we going to start talking to the non-state actor who actually controlled the territory. For me as a UN official, there were several risks in me directly meeting with or validating the non-state armed group, which at least one state considers to be a terrorist actor. And so that part of the negotiation was led by my colleague Anne, who for several years did the same kind of work with the SDF, a kind of constructive ambiguity about who was talking to who, to enable us to sort of start to align some of these things that needed to be aligned to physically get there. This, aside from the two key actors, the SDF and the Syrians, the other problem was that there are a bunch of other states with presence on the territory. And so part of getting on, even though technically you're only supposed to ask the territorial state for access, you need the other state's agreement as well, which meant talking to the Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks. And all of those, just to state the very obvious, we can say more in the Q&A, that was extremely complicated. It was even more complicated after the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. And similar to the Syrians, nobody, especially from the human rights bodies, was talking to the Russians. So even making your way up in an armored vehicle to the Russian compound in Geneva probably meant that there were 30 people watching you walking in the door and making, so it was complicated. And then this just tells us a little bit about the complexity of the map. There's the complexity of control, there's the complexity of state interest, and then there's the complexity of the makeup of the Syrian regime, which is of course controlled by minority Alawites and has long been a non-representative place. And the place that we were physically trying to get to, you see at the top, the book is called on the Qamishli, is this small little town, which we were basically where the UN has its headquarters, and that was where we were trying to go. So this book is called The Road to Damascus, and in part it's the road motif runs through it, because the first road to get to was to get to Damascus. And it was the culmination of those conversations with the Syrians, the Russians, the United States, the Iranians, and the Turks including a really irate conversation with a Turkish official as we were about to board a plane to Lebanon in the summer of 2023, who insisted that he would not secure our security in certain parts of the territory we were traveling in. We traveled to get to Damascus. We had to travel to through Lebanon and Beirut because there's no access from the west into Damascus. There's a sanction in place that doesn't allow flights into Damascus. And so we traveled up through Lebanon. And one of the things I would say, I just introduced my team because they figure really prominently in the book. Anne is here, who's been my senior legal advisor for a long time and my colleague for longer. We had a full security team. We traveled in 2 armored vehicles. And at the back, you see Yasmin, who was the human rights officer who supported the visit and also doubled as our translator. One of the things I would say as we were traveling from Beirut up towards Damascus, Assad is everywhere. So this first picture you see on this side, this is the reception right at the border. We got VIP treatment, so we didn't go through regular passport checks. But we were brought in to have tea with the welcoming Syrian delegation. But quite literally everywhere you move, pictures of the president, pictures of his father, pictures of his brother. And so this motif of like, Assad is everywhere was one of the kind of accompanying motifs. Once we get to Damascus, we spent several days in Damascus meeting with various interlocutors in the government. And I would say we were staying, one of the things we were advised before we left was all of the UN personnel in Damascus stay in one hotel. This is the designated hotel by the regime. The conservative estimate is that there are 300 surveillance cameras in the hotel. So it is not a place where you have a conversation with anyone about anything. We didn't bring our phones or our computers. On these kinds of visits, everything is scrubbed. We go in with clean computers and clean phones. And the operative assumption was that we were under surveillance all the time because we were accompanied, but also that even in your room, you were under surveillance. After we had the first part of the visit in Damascus, we then took an internal flight from Damascus to Qamishli. And that's a UN flight. It's a there's a humanitarian flight that goes once a week that we hopped a ride on. And I think one of the things I would say, well, maybe I'll go back to the compound, is that when we got to Qamishli, one of the things you'll see is that this territory is like a checkerboard. The airport is controlled by the regime, but you stand outside, you literally go 50 meters from me to Kayla as you stand out of the airport, and there's Russian control, then you go through an SDF checkpoint. So you are constantly moving through different kinds of control. The control is just incredibly fluid and changes day to day. The compound sits in the center of Qamishli, and it's a fortified compound for a reason. And the other thing I would say, when we got there, it was July. It was 50 degrees. It was incredibly hot. And because the Turks have switched off the water supply, this is one of their tactics, there is very little water in North East Syria. And electricity supply is variable because, again, the Turks in particular have been hitting infrastructure support to the SDF, in part to make life unlivable. You can sort of get a sense of the landscape. It's barren, it's poor, and our primary goal was to stay alive, but our secondary goal was to get to the prisons. And to do that, you're like maneuvering through this territorial control, like constantly in motion. Curfew ran till 6 o'clock each evening, so you had to be off the road and back in the compound. And maybe just to talk about the data points, why we were there. I was there to see prisons. And negotiating those prisons meant negotiating access. The government lets you in, but you're negotiating access to the prisons through the Syrian Democratic Forces and to certain of these prisons to the YPG, not the sort of generic SDF, but the military command structure. And the book talks a little bit about the complexity of that negotiation, of actually negotiating with the SDF. Once we as we got there, we were just gathering information. And I think that the key finding, both of the report but also on the visit, is we were actually able to figure out how many people were there. And, over 70,000 people arbitrarily detained in North East Syria. Over 50% of that population is under 12 years old. So this is the largest single detention facility for children anywhere in the world. There is zero legal process, none. There is no legal, this is a legal black hole, but it is a legal black hole supported by a coalition of democratic states whose nationals are also being held in the territory and whose intelligence services have regular access to that population for the purposes of interrogation and information seeking. The conditions of confinement are grim. We could say more in the Q&A, but my finding was that they met the threshold for torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law. The large-scale prisons, this is Al-Hol camp. These are the two main camps. And these tent-like structures are what people live in. And in 50-degree heat, 50-degree heat is pretty unbearable if you're in a UN air-conditioned convoy. It's incredibly terrible if you're sitting outside and living in these conditions. So we visited both of these camps. The other thing, there were two other types of prisons that I really wanted to visit. One was these so-called detention facilities or rehabilitation facilities for boys. One of the practices of the SDF, supported by the Global Coalition on Daesh, is to take children from their mothers starting as early as 9 up until their early teens and violently detach these boys from their moms. And so we wanted to visit the camps or the detention facilities that were holding those boys. And during the course of the visit, I think I interviewed 300 boys. And sometimes the first couple of weeks I came back, well, these boys stay with you. And one of them, I'll talk about one of them, Bilal. He was an American kid. Actually, we had heard there was an American kid in one of these camps, but no one had verified or seen him. So kind of and getting access to this kid was really important to me because I knew that if we could eyeball him and interview him, our chances of kind of opening up a discourse would be much stronger. So Bilal was 16 at the time, and I asked him what he missed, and he said he missed hamburgers. He really missed hamburgers. And he wanted to talk about rap music. He was really into Drake, and they didn't have access to these things, but these are the things he remembered about his life before he came. He was brought by parents. Obviously, he was brought as a minor. He did not give consent to come to North East Syria, and mostly he wanted to go home to see his grandma in New Jersey. One of the things that we were able to do when we left is I called my friend Charlie Savage at the New York Times, and I said, there's an American kid in this jail, and you need to run a story on him. And he did. And the good news is that that kid got home, partly because Charlie Savage, not me, ran a story in the New York Times. So the boys were a particular concern of mine, and my finding in my report to the General Assembly was that their separation and violence constituted a war. It constitutes both a crime against humanity and a war crime of conscription, enlistment, and use of children under international law. The prison I most wanted to get to, which I thought I wouldn't get to, is a prison called Panorama. Panorama is the prison in which all of the high security ISIL men, are those who were captured after Raqqa, are held. And it was pretty clear that prison was off the table. It's a British-built prison by British taxpayer money. And there's a strong coordination between the SDF and the US, actually, on the control and operation of that prison. There's a long story, but I ended up getting into that prison because we had a standoff with the SDF about some things they didn't give me, and I threatened to leave, and they gave me a 3-hour window at this prison. And what I can say about that prison, which I already said to the General Assembly, was this is a prison in which there was widespread TB. Our estimate was somewhere between 70 to 75% of the population, the male population, had TB untreated, and that these men were being starved. So what I saw and documented were skeletal men with TB who were essentially the hope, I think, was that they would die in prison. Just to say, a clear breach of international law. And of course, the fact that this is not just done by a non-state actor, but supported and enabled by democratic states who are both paying for the prison in which their own nationals are dying and facilitated and enabled by military support of those states, creates legal obligations, in my view, for those states. Okay, maybe I'll close by saying that there's a lot to say about all of this. The book is a story of the journey, about getting there. It's a story about what we saw. But it's also a story about what produces terrorism. And I wrote an op-ed piece yesterday on Aleppo. And none of us who've been to, well, there's not that many of us who've been to North East Syria. But if you've been to North East Syria, you would not be surprised by what happened in Aleppo this weekend. Because anyone who thought ISIL was defeated was wrong, because they weren't. Because nobody addressed the conditions that produced the violence in the first place. The conditions that bred the tolerance, capacity, and enablement of these groups, those conditions are still rife on the ground in Northeast Syria and Northwest Syria. So these conditions, these push-pull factors, nothing has happened to change that. And the so-called military defeat of ISIS is actually meaningless in terms of not solving the fundamental crisis. The second is that it's really clear that this idea of what's happening to children in Northeast Syria is unacceptable. The vast majority of this population is a child population under 12 years old who either did not choose to be born there or did not choose to go there, and are clearly the international community's obligation to these children, their own children. Remember, these are children from 57 countries plus Syria and Iraq are being I would say observed in the breach. And one of the motifs I use in my writing about these children is the motif of unchilding. How do you make a child not a child under international law? And here I use and have relied for years on the work of my colleague, former colleague at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who talks about the idea of unchilding in international law. How when we deem certain children to be non-children, when we refuse to accept that a child is not a child, and we call a child a terrorist, or the association of a terrorist, or born from a terrorist, or living near a terrorist, or found in a home where a terrorist is, then you can kill, maim, destroy, harm that child with impunity. And we've seen that in other places, but we're certainly seeing it in Northeast Syria. And it's that process of unchilding that's facilitating the harms that I saw firsthand. I think this Syria reveals the absolute failure of the war on terror. Lots to say about that, but it's clear that the fueling of violence doesn't stop. And what we see is a practice of states that I call citizen dumping. You don't want to deal with your citizens, you leave it for other regions and other states. And that's not just a human rights issue, but it is also a security issue, as we saw in Aleppo this weekend. And maybe finally to say that all of these other things like food, like shelter, all of these things, there are civil and political rights violations galore, but there's also lack of access to water, lack of access to shelter, lack of access to the most basic things that I think is setting up Northeast Syria for a cradle-to-grave detention experience. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you all. I can call. See lots of my students. Go, Kayla. Yeah.
So you talked about the British national case where she was formally stripped of her citizenship.
Yeah.
Are you aware? Are there other states that are formally stripping, or is it also mostly just people basically ignoring that they're citizens?
No, there's a healthy practice so there are two, formal citizenship stripping is happening where people are notified. But what we were tracking, and we had a really close working relationship with the UNHCR, and in particular that part of UNHCR that deals with statelessness, that we think what was actually happening is that there was mass stripping, but non-notification. So that the states were not, because of course it's illegal under international law to make a person stateless. But what we were seeing was a practice of citizenship stripping, but non-notification in many European countries. That's really what we were seeing. So both and, formal and non-notified. Yeah, yeah. Go, Nui. Oh.
Oh, here.
You put through the UK law or the European law?
So we started off in a body called SIAC, which is the Special Immigration Tribunal, which is a special UK administrative body that deals with questions of nationality stripping and on security grounds. It went as far as the Supreme Court. We are gearing up to go to the European Court of Human Rights on the Begum case. And I have every expectation we're going to win because the egregiousness of the violation. In fact, what's really interesting in the Begum case is the Special Immigration Tribunal, which has access to all of the intelligence information about this person, essentially said, we believe that she was trafficked and groomed and she's 15, remember? Try to imagine what stupid 15-year-olds do. They do lots of very stupid things. But the articulation of the right to citizenship strip in UK law is at the full discretion of the Minister the Minister of Interior Affairs. So the finding was that she was a victim, but the discretion, the courts said that they could not lawfully touch the discretion of the minister to strip. So I think the European Court will have something to say about the exercise of the discretion. Yeah. Yeah. Go.
What is the standard that the European, I don't know, what is the standard that they apply if they're going to be doing discretionary act under UK law?
Yeah.
Is it, arbitrary and capricious or?
Yeah, so Europe is a little different from so each of these states, the United Kingdom is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, and it has been absorbed into domestic law. So it's somewhat different from the US, which doesn't absorb international law into its domestic system. It means that European law is European human rights law is part and parcel of British law. I think the convention has a provision against arbitrariness. There's a requirement of arbitrariness in the deprivation of civil and other rights. And I think I think this is going to touch on the arbitrariness standard of the European Convention. And I mean, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. But I think actually the domestic record in Begum's case helps us because the courts themselves were really clear that it was his discretion, but it's very clear that they're very uncomfortable with the exercise of the discretion, but they don't feel they have the formal right to override it. Whereas I don't think the European Court will feel equally constrained. Yeah. Yeah, Barb.
Who is funding for the forces?
Oh, yeah.
Who are detained? I'm interested in the force to actually detain all these.
Yeah, really good question. So, I mean, as a formal matter, the entity in charge of the detention facilities are all the Syrian Democratic Forces. Like there aren't US soldiers standing or British soldiers or other members, Italian members of the coalition. But so the actual physical containment, the parameters, the guarding, all of that, the interviewing, some of the interview, I'll just drop a footnote on it, is done by the SDF. But the SDF is backed by the United States. One of the things we were able to do on the prison, so in summer of 2021, we just did some white-collar crime searching, basically. We looked at 3 years of British budget, the MOD spending. We were actually able to trace the costing and payment of the prison by spending a lot of time looking at how they were funding the SDF. And then when I actually got into that prison, which is not, there were square plugs, like British made, you know. So we were able to identify the sort of financial lift that these countries are engaged in. There's also a training piece. The United States and its allies in the Global Coalition Against Daesh train and provide technical assistance. So that includes like things like barbed wire. It includes like we also think biometric data capacity, because there's been at least 2 biometric data exercises done in these facilities that the SDF don't have the capacity to run. I will say one of the things that leads to the finding of ongoing jurisdiction, so for the lawyers in the room, one of the arguments I made as special rapporteur, and we argued at several courts, but is that many of these states exercise jurisdiction under sort of a divided notion of jurisdiction from ECHR jurisprudence. And part of the reason we saw that, and this for those who know a case called Al-Skani, we were able to ascertain that the intelligence forces of many of these countries have direct access to their own nationals in these prisons, which means they have a kind of functional control that I think meets the Al-Skani test under the ECHR in terms of also having an obligation to prevent violations to their nationals. So the day-to-day is the SDF, but the infrastructure of support is the United States and its allies under the Global Coalition. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Well, it's not a cup of tea. It's definitely, these are coercive, like, if we think about the conditions of confinement, people are being interrogated in a context where there's no lawful basis for their detention. It's arbitrary detention. So we start with that there's no legal basis to detain, and that itself is a problem to start with. The second, I think, problem is that we have, and again, you know, there are, we think, over 70,000 people detained there, and I interviewed lots of children, but a much smaller subsection of adults, because I prioritize meeting children. But of the first-hand accounts we were able to garner, both from third countries and from in situ, that those interrogations are often coercive, including violent. So clearly, that's a breach. If you're a European Convention state, it's a breach of Article 3. But it's also really clear that many of the intelligence services have been very, I mean, this is why access for us was so difficult, because the fact that we were able to validate, we were able to ascertain that there is that access by state. So these states are often saying, well, what the SDF does is their business. Like, we don't like that they do these human rights violations, but that's not us. But the fact that you're able to quantify the scale of access from intelligence services of other states means that you very concretely can argue state responsibility in those sites. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll take maybe 2. One here, one at the back. Yeah, go.
You referred to ISIL. Other people talk about ISIS. Other people talk about
Daesh.
So are these all the same group? And are they actually formally organized, where there's a command structure and a financing basis for all this?
So those terms are, no, those groups are that terminology is interchangeable. In my UN reports, actually, the UN nomenclature is Daesh, so that's the terminology, but I shorthand ISIL just because I've got used to calling them that. Yes, these are, I mean, to say of course they're organized. They're groups who I think, at least under the law of war, meet the threshold for Protocol 2 of the optional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, because they're sufficiently organized, they control territory. They don't implement the conventions, clearly. These are brutal or terrorist organizations who are engaged in serious harm, but they are organized. So they meet, I think, the threshold for an armed group under the law of war. They are well financed. A lot of the financing both came from the raising of something that not taxes in the traditional sense, but squeezing the populations in the territories they control, sale of antiquities, sale of oil. North East Syria is a place in which there are significant natural resources that can be leveraged by the non-state groups and by the state. So yeah, they're a pretty organized group. There are other groups. The group, for example, we saw in Aleppo this weekend is a different group. But that group has its roots. They actually originally were, the core of that group were ISIS affiliated, and then they moved affiliated to Al-Qaeda. So these groups are fluid. There's a sort of a core, but you see movement between and within them over time. Yeah. One more, I think it's go.
Yeah, hi, it's Mackenzie. Thank you so much for your talk. I will really look forward to reading your book when it's published. I was in Central Asia in the spring for several months, working with practitioners who were leading the reintegration efforts for primarily women and children who'd been returned from Northeast Syria. Yeah. And one thing that really struck me when I was there was this really strong national narrative that women are not powerful, and therefore, as an extension, they're sort of not capable of being radicalized, that the women who've returned are really, they're victims, they were taken there, and that they are not the terrorists, right. Which is not the case for all the women in the group. It's not the case that they're all radicalized or all not. It's just the idea that radicalization comes from a position of power means that women can't have that. And since you're a scholar of both counterterrorism and gender, I would be curious to hear your reflections on the ways that the field is gendered, because I think the converse of women can't be terrorists is that boys are. Yeah. And so I would just be curious to hear how that was part of your approach and how you like to think about that now.
Yeah, I think a couple of things can be simultaneously true. It's certainly the case that in the Caucasus, so Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, these are all countries that we had very close working relationships with, and they gave us access to sizable populations. And so two things were interesting. The decision to return was an executive decision in all of those cases made by the president, who is all-powerful in all of those countries. And it was made on two grounds. One was this very interesting narrative. The children of the nation are our children. We see our children as ours, and even if they've done bad things or they've been associated with bad people, we bring them back. I think that's a very interesting and distinct way from the way Western states and other states treat the children they think are like other, right? And they're othered in very specific ethnicized, religiousized ways. But the second is exactly right, your comment about this idea that where do women sit in the kind of masculinity and patriarchy of those societies? These are very traditional societies. And my experience of interviewing hundreds of women, I've interviewed lots and lots of women who were members of, associated with, family members of these groups, is that all of this is true. Some women were in family structures that were highly patriarchal. There was no choice. If the husband says you're going, you're going. And I think in societies where we think women can always say what they want to do, that we simply fail to understand the complexity of family relations. But you have highly radicalized women. I've interviewed lots of those women too. Women who independently and autonomously were part of these designated terrorist groups, committed violence, including against other women, and both are true. I think for these countries, you're not going to change their view of women generally, and that view of women has helped bring them back. But I would say we see the alternative narrative in the West, right, which is that women of particular groups are assumed because you're X or Y, because you're because you're Kurdish, you're a terrorist, because you're Palestinian, you're a terrorist, because you're Catholic in Northern Ireland, you're a terrorist, right? That narrative, I think, is equally as sort of rigid as the narrative that says, yeah, they're all victims. So it's the lack of nuance that I think is really problematic. But the other thing I would say that we have seen, and it goes to Mackenzie's point, is that across the globe, men and boys in particular are presumed non-civilian. And we see that in multiple comments. The very fact of your gender as a boy once you pass the age of 11 or 12, you are presumed a combatant. You are denied the right to be treated as a civilian de facto. So you may have this theoretical legal right to civilian status under international law, and you may have this theoretical right to child status under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but your gender excludes you from that protection. And this is, I'm about to go to a conference in the next couple of weeks around the rights of children deprived of liberty, but one of the things we're seeing is the boy child as like absolutely, and I have 2 boys, and I think a lot about what it would mean to be a boy in Syria, a boy in Palestine, a boy in Ukraine, countries where just the fact that you're a boy means that you will never get the protection that international law owes to you. So yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mackenzie.